up. As Captain Wolver shows, it only takes an instant, and he is ready to fire.
Now show us where on the stick and the throttle you have your missile launching buttons.
Okay. What we have here are basically a trigger that's up front here, you can see here, and also the missile button is this red button up here.
By the way, Captain Wolver expects to be flying off soon to Saudi Arabia.
And of course, as we all know, war is so much more than technology. There are pilots missing today and any number of Iraqis killed. We simply do not know how many. Once again, the major...
To this point?
Yeah, my theory is that the electronic countermeasures shut the Iraqi communications down, that we had a lot of capabilities that were developed over the years against the communications of the Soviet Union, designing to shut those down if we ever had a war. And we used it against Iraq, which of course is less sophisticated communications than the Soviets had. And in the case of either country, the Soviet Union or Iraq, they operate a very, very highly centralized military command, which means that if a commander gets instructions, he does exactly what he's told, no more, no less. And when he finishes that, he waits for instructions from Central Command as to what he's to do next. If you shut down the command and control there, which I think they did early in this process, what that means is people are waiting for orders to fire, waiting for orders to take off. Never came.
President Bush warned today against euphoria. Do you think the facts up till now justify some euphoria?
No, I think it's going to be a longer process. I said from the beginning that I thought it was going to be a war of weeks, that there would be casualties. I believe that ultimately we will have to use ground forces. You know, there's that debate as to whether air forces can use it alone, and we'll see. But I ultimately believe that ground forces will be needed to push the Iraqi troops out of Kuwait.
You supported the president's decision to do this. A couple of days later, are you having any second thoughts?
No, I think that's the right decision, and no second thoughts.
When you look ahead, based on what has happened already, and superimpose it or whatever you would like on your own scenarios, the research you did before, what are the most difficult military things coming up, and when are they coming up?
Okay, I think the air part of the thing is pretty well in hand. The fact that we were able to get through those first couple of days with as few casualties as we did, and that we are well on our way towards establishing air superiority, I think that means that the air part of it is well in hand. The one still remaining big problem is the Scud missiles, which you've already talked about on the show. And incidentally, at the briefings, they talked about more launchers than your experts talked about tonight.
So, well, they had talked about there were 30, and then General Schwarzkopf had said 6 had been destroyed,
right.
So 24. But you're saying there's still more than that out there.
Well, those 30 were the ones that came with the Scuds when they bought from the Soviet Union. What we've heard in the briefings is that the Iraqis have the ability to make Erectors, and they put them on the back of trucks, and they launch a missile off of the back of the truck. Now, the problem with that is it destroys the truck, but it's kind of a flatbed truck, like maybe more like a railway car than a truck. But they have an undetermined number of those that are handmade. I say handmade, made by the Iraqi indigenous forces, not bought from the military of the Soviet Union or some other country. And they don't know how many. They, meaning the United States military, has no idea how many of those are.
I mean, are they talking 100?
I think they're talking tens anyway.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that the missile launchers that we were talking about earlier in the show essentially are missile launchers that were bought from the Soviet Union. Each one of those launchers can launch over and over again. In other words, the rocket goes off of the launching pad, you can reload it with another missile and use it again. So what that means is it's a target that you have to get with the Air Force, because they can, as long as they have missiles, and as the expert said, it's possible into the hundreds, each of those launchers could launch many, many missiles. But there's a whole other set of launchers out there that were made and are being constructed for one shot firings, and they frankly don't have any idea how many of those are.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a big, get back to the problem. That's the real major problem that I see, is the possibility of an attack on Israel from those mobile Scud launchers, which leaves, again, the question of what happens to the coalition.
I see.
But in the early phases of the campaign, the air phases of the campaign, that's the one remaining issue.
I see.
Now, the second part is, of course, when the ground forces get there, and that raises a whole new set of uncertainties.
Congressman, how do you feel about this growing war protest movement in the country?
I think it's part of the business of part of the cost of doing business in this country. It's part of the way in which people have to express their opinions. It's becoming commonplace. You remember at the time it began back in Vietnam, people were kind of surprised and shocked that people would actually do things like burn flags and protest and whatever, but I think it's part of the process. It's the way people have of exhibiting their opinions about things, and I'm not bothered by it. I think it's healthy, and it's part of the system that we have here. And other countries maybe don't understand that, and maybe Saddam Hussein gets the wrong message, etc., but yeah, that's too bad for him. We shouldn't change our way of doing business just to suit some foreigner's idea about how government ought to work.
Well, as you know, the anti-war movement in Vietnam had terrific effect in the final analysis over how that war was ended and when it was ended. Do you see a similar thing happening in this case?
No, I think this is going to be a much shorter war. Clearly, the anti-war movement in Vietnam built upon something that was real, which was that the war was going on, and there was a lot of American casualties, and there was no end in sight. And clearly, if that were to develop in another situation, you would see people turning against the war, too. In fact, I think the evidence was that towards the end of the Korean War, there was a lot of unhappiness with what was going on in Korea. There was no protests like there were in Vietnam, but the public opinion polls clearly showed that the public had turned against it. I think that's, if the outcome of any conflict in the future is that we get bogged down, no end in sight, a lot of casualties, I think that's what's going to happen. The people are going to turn against it, and they're going to turn against it whether there's protesters or not.
All right. Congressman Aspin, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Judy?
Now to Representative Patricia Schroeder of Colorado, another Democratic member of the Armed Services Committee and chair of its subcommittee on military installations and facilities. She's been a member of the panel since 1973, when she was first elected to Congress on a platform opposing the Vietnam War. Congresswoman, do you pretty much agree with the scenario of how the war is going so far as laid out by Congressman Aspin?
Well, I think there's no question that the air war is going very well. I never supposed it would do anything but go very well. I think what we're finding out is that Saddam Hussein is much more of a paper tiger than people thought, and that also it shows you how very difficult it is to be a dictator. When you're a dictator, you're terrified of coups. When you're terrified of coups, what do? You don't allow your military to do anything without your controlling it. If they do anything at all different than what you tell them, you shoot them. And so what he's really done is hoisted himself on his own rules by saying no one could do anything without Central Command. You hit Central Command, and he's then got a dispersed military that can do nothing because they can't get his word.
How concerned are you about the ground combat that most people are saying lies ahead?
I'm very concerned about that, Judy. I think that that's the part where it all breaks down. We have seen wonderful air superiority in other conflicts, as you know, Vietnam and many others. We've had great air superiority. I think the real question is the morale of the Iraqi troops and how ideologically bound they are to their leader. We're not quite sure about that. Obviously, your intelligence never lets you know, so our psychological warfare is working on that. But if we have to go in and fight bunker to bunker and hole to ground hole, we're in real trouble.
Why?
Well, because I think you're going to see very high casualties, very high casualties. And I think a lot of people are going to say, if our air war was so successful in taking out biological weapons, taking out chemical weapons, taking out any potential nuclear capacity, taking out missile sites, taking out his air superiority, then all he has are really almost guerrilla-type forces left on the ground. And the real question is, why don't those in the neighborhood then solve that? Why is that still an American problem at that point? Because the things that could spill over into the other countries and expand this are now gone. We've now really narrowed and defined the problem. And I think there'll be an awful lot of questions of why American lives are being expended to go that route.
Well, do you think at that point that it will not be an American problem, that it's something that ought to be handled by the neighborhood, as you put it?
Well, if you look at our Arab allies in the neighborhood, they have over 1 million men in uniform. That's a lot. And it's their neighborhood, and he's their bully. And I think it's incumbent upon us to try and help with the things that we have talent in they don't have, or we have capacities they don't have. But I'm not sure we have to make it our war. And I've had a lot of trouble in seeing us run in there and say, this is our war. And then the question is, if we do the ground war, Judy, does that mean we're then going to stay there and guarantee the peace and occupy for a while and make sure Iraq is not run over by the Syrians or the Iranians or whoever else wants to come in? I mean, what are we talking about long term? So I would like to see us do our part and then say to the people in the area, the threat of any kind of expansion has now been taken away. And I think it's incumbent upon the neighbors here to get this neighborhood back in order.
Now, what are you suggesting? Are you suggesting they ought to be more involved in the ground combat, or are you talking about after that phase?
Well, I'm saying they ought to start with the ground combat, because I think if we do all the ground combat, and you see phenomenal casualties from it, and you're very apt to see that, and then I think it gets harder and harder to extricate ourselves from there, and we become the policemen of the region. I've said one of the big problems is America's been the 911 number for the world. And we can be the 911 number for things that we have capabilities in and the world doesn't. But they've got ground troops, and they've got 1 million, and they can get there, and they can do a lot of this. And I think at that point, our expertise isn't needed.
Well, do you think that's what the Pentagon plans to do, or do you think they're planning a mostly American effort on the ground?
One of the things that troubles me, Judy, is, as you know, both the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mr. Powell, and of course the General Schwarzkopf, are both Army. And I think one of the problems we always have is every segment of the services want their piece of the action. Now, the Army does some very good things, but I hope they don't feel that they have to do a land assault equivalent to the air assault so that everybody gets their piece. The Army's been very supportive and done good things, but hopefully they can train our allies in that region to go forward with the latest tactics for the ground war and not have Americans do it. I don't think that's what they're thinking about, but that's what I would like to see them think about.
You obviously voted against this authorization last weekend. Do you still, it sounds like you're saying at this point, you still have grave misgivings about this whole endeavor? Well, absolutely. I still think the sanctions would have worked. I think he was really a paper tiger. I think we tend to take these people and blow them into these great, huge, 10-foot tall monsters. And as we've seen from the air war, he really wasn't that equipped. And yet you voted today, is that correct, for the resolution supporting the troops? Is that right? You bet. Let me tell you, I lived through the Vietnam War. That was my generation. And a lot of my friends were in Vietnam. I never again, even though I protested the policy of Vietnam, I don't want to see people take the protest from the war and attach it to the people who were sent to enforce the policy. If you don't like the policy, come after the policymakers, the Pat Schroeders, but don't go after the people who were sent over to enforce the policy. They didn't have any choice. So I think it's very important this time we never allow that mistake to be made again, and that we say to our men and women over there, we're supporting you on the mission you've been sent to do, even though I may disagree with the mission. Well, and just quickly, the vote was overwhelming, 399 for, 6 against, and 6